Good morning, everyone. This talk is a continuation of the previous talk, which was about preparing for conflict, where I used this book, Conflicted, by Ian Leslie, which I can recommend. It gives you a lot of helpful information. And then the other book that I'm using as a basis for this talk is one of my favorite books, Families Where Grace is in Place, and I find that useful for any relationship and also for conflicts. So what I've decided to do is to follow Jeff van Vonderen's good example in Families Where Grace is in Place. He uses an acronym for his book, and I've decided acronyms are great because otherwise I feel like I'm just going to flood you with a whole lot of information. So the acronym in terms of how we approach a conflict or a difficult conversation is graceful. So I'm going to hook something onto every letter as we go. I'll give you a quick overview. So it's going to start with God. I think that's a good place to start. The G, then the R is about responding. The A, affirming. The C, context. The E, emotions. F, freedom. Unlocking the gridlock. And L, listen, which in a way is actually where one should start. But I'm just pointing it out right at the beginning so it frames the whole picture as we go. So starting with God, if we believe that God is in control of everything and this is God's story, then this is actually also God's conflict and God's difficult conversation, which feels a little bit awkward and a little bit weird, but at the same time, if he has a plan, even with this conflict, and this conflict fits into his story and the bigger picture in some way, then my job is not to control things during the conflict, but my job is actually to be open to the plan and to try and find out and to be open to the fact that maybe through this conflict situation, he's going to change me in some way. I might learn something new. I might grow in some unexpected way. Other people in the conflict might grow. And it might be an opportunity to share his love with somebody in an unexpected way. So if that is the beginning, the way that I approach conflict, I can see some people in the room looking rather doubtful. Then that changes my whole approach to conflict situations. And I don't straight away go, oh my goodness, what's going on? But I can actually go, okay, this might be uncomfortable, and I'm not saying it's not going to be uncomfortable. But perhaps in some way, God is going to use this. And I don't have to appear to be in control of the situation. I don't have to control others. It's not my job to control other people. I don't have to try and control them in some sort of, power dynamic, and they must do this and they must behave in this way and they must calm down. They must stop doing that. That's not my job. They need to be looking at themselves and looking at their own self-control, and I need to look at my own self-control under God. I also don't have to try and manipulate them into behaving in a specific way. So, using those words always and never to try and get them onto my side. And I realize I can't change others. I can only bring myself before God and ask him to change me. So going into a conflict situation at the beginning, going, I'm not in here to try and change somebody to control the situation, to control them, means I start in a very different space. I don't have to be right. And that is so often what happens in a conflict. If somebody says something and we immediately react, we go, but that's wrong. And we know what's right. And we feel like we need to convince them to come onto our side. So, God is ultimately in control, then he could be in control even here. And I also, if I think about it from that point of view, then I need to be sure that I am using his resources because it is his conflict. So I need to rely on him, pray at the beginning. If you can't remember to pray, it's not like it's like, the end all, but if you are living your life being reliant on him as your source and your source of identity, of meaning, of value, and you have that as a basis for this conflict situation, this conversation, then you start in a very different space. So I think this makes it possible to respond. So we come to the R. And responding is, on the one hand, about self-awareness, about knowing what's going on in yourself, in your body, in your mind. So the self-awareness about, there's a name for it, about introspection, when you check in with yourself and you're aware of what's going on in your body, you're aware of your own physical state, how high your anxiety is, and whether your sympathetic nervous system is on overdrive or not. And once you have that awareness, then you can do something about it. And this is where Kanye and I spoke in, I think it was June, about practicing self-regulation, where, again, you can pray, you can breathe, you can use a number of different techniques that help you to access your parasympathetic nervous system, which is the one that calms you down. And then you can actually respond rather than just react out of your gut. So if you need a reminder, I think it's on the TGIF YouTube. So on the other hand, if you are actually triggered, which you will feel in your body, what can you actually do? I think it's important for us to make a mental note of the fact that we are reacting very strongly to what's going on, but to not react out of that very strong emotion. So we can make a mental note to investigate a little bit further afterwards. In that moment, I find it quite useful to actually change my body's position and to think, okay, this is my trigger spot. I'll just move out of it and I'll go into another spot. Or if I'm sitting in a specific way, that I actually just really change my position and make a mental decision that I'm moving out of my trigger position into a different position. And I'm leaving that trigger there to investigate further afterwards. And I do think investigating those triggers is really helpful in terms of our own growth. Often we are actually triggered by something that is very similar to what we do ourselves. And that's not where we want to go. That's not what we want to hear. But it's very biblical. Jesus tells us to remove the log out of our own eyes before we try and remove the speck out of somebody else's. So even in our triggers, I think we need to look at, why is this triggering me? Is this actually something that I do? And this is why I have such a strong reaction. It could also be that the trigger is about some relational work that I need to do. So I need to go back to another relationship. This specific instance, whatever has gone on in this conversation, has brought a very strong reaction from me because I haven't actually worked through something previous in another relationship. So it's a reminder to go back and to look at what was actually going on in that relationship. Do we need to do some relational work? Do I need to repent? Do I need to forgive? Then there's also, triggers also reveal what is most important to us. And that's a good thing in some senses, because there are some things that are really good things that we do feel strongly about. It could be something like justice, something that's really a good thing in God's plan. But on the other hand, it could also, if we really go down lower, it could be something that is more of an idol. So it could be that, somebody damages something that belongs to us. Maybe somebody scratches our car. And yes, it's right to feel angry about that and to get involved in a conversation with the person you see who's done it. But at the same time, if you really look down, how deeply does this caring go? Have you put this material thing above everything else? So it might be that way. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's worth investigating. And then it also reveals our stereotypes or our prejudices often. When we react to something in a conversation, then we could actually be reacting not just to that person in that specific instance, but to who they represent or what they represent. And on the other hand, it's a good thing to just keep in mind that maybe it works the other way around as well. So when somebody else is having a very strong reaction to us, it might not actually be about us. It might be about what or who we represent. So that's looking at triggers a little bit more. But in the situation itself, once I have moved out of my trigger position and into another space and tried the self-regulation to be able to respond in a calmer way, then it would be helpful to try and slow things down a bit. And you slow things down in that kind of conversation by listening more. So listening is going to come up again and again. And by asking questions like, you could ask them to repeat what they said so that you can understand it more clearly, which also slows things down and helps you listen again. Or even if you're feeling quite brave, you can say, just hold on, how are you actually experiencing this conversation? But you need to be brave to do that in the middle of a conflict situation, but it does really slow things down once you start having that conversation. And also, in terms of responding, sometimes you need to negotiate taking a break from the conversation and just say, okay, I really want to talk about this, but right now is not a good time for me. I'm just too emotional. There's too much going on. Can I just either take a short break, or can we postpone this conversation to another time? So I think it's good to talk about the conflict situation, but it's good to talk about it at the right time. And you don't always have to feel like when somebody has started a conversation, that is the right time. It might not be. So that's about responding. Okay. Thirdly, affirming. So firstly, I think you need to affirm the connection that you have with the other person. Connect with them on common ground. So if you can find something that you have in common with them, then you can refer back to that. You can open up a little bit about yourself. Vulnerability often invites vulnerability from the other person. I know you think, oh my goodness, in a conflict situation to be vulnerable, you need to decide how vulnerable you're going to be, what you're comfortable with. But whatever you are saying and doing is an invitation for the other person to say and do in a similar way. So if you attack them, it's an invitation for them to attack you. If you shame them, it's an invitation for them to shame you. If you are vulnerable with them, it's an invitation for them to be vulnerable with you. But you need to be aware of your boundaries and decide at what level you're going to be vulnerable. There's also, if you can connect around a positive outcome to this conversation, and you can talk about what you want and not what you don't want, then that also is helpful. To connect around a positive common goal. You can also connect around agreements that you share. For example, we are human beings made in God's image, and human dignity is the basis for the respect that we have for each other, which means you don't shame, you don't blame, point fingers, call people names. You can also agree that you are going to work on this relationship by trying to address this conflict. So the relationship is important to both of you. Or you could also agree that if you see the problem as separate to yourselves, and you together are on the team trying to solve the problem and not pointing fingers at each other and saying, you are the problem, or you are the problem, then that also is an agreement that forms a good connecting basis for a conversation. And you can also connect around emotions, but I'll talk more about that when we get to emotions. The other, I want to say thing to affirm, but it sort of goes against what I'm saying, is the other person who's not a thing. So really to affirm that the other person is a multi-dimensional individual with strengths and abilities. We have a tendency to flatten other people, to see them as one-dimensional, especially when we are in conflict situations with them, and to see ourselves as complex. We have reasons for the way things are, the way that we're reacting right now, but other people, they're just idiots, or we label them. So if we can come into this conversation affirming that the other person also has strengths and abilities, and it might feel strange to actually say something positive to them, but at the same time, if you say positive things to somebody, then they are much more likely to also hear the negative. Nancy Klein, in her book Time to Think, which I don't have here, but which I think is also a really valuable book, she says the ratio of positive to negative in terms of criticism should be 5-1. So positive 5, negative 1. And I think it's it's one of those challenges for us. We have a tendency to just jump in there with whatever it is that we see as negative, even in our relationships with our children. Then the other thing to affirm about the other person is that there's an image that they want to portray, a public image, which is particularly important when there's a power differential between you. If you're the person who has more power and the other person and you do not actually affirm the public image the other person wants to portray, then you already put them on the defense. So this, in the book, Ian Leslie says, he uses the example of Mandela and Viljoen, General Viljoen, when the first time that they met, where he actually served him tea. And just that action of serving him tea and a very practical way of doing servant leadership already made him feel, General Viljoen, feel a little bit more comfortable. He was coming in at in terms of the power differential, coming in from the bottom. So just a simple action like that can actually help to affirm the other person and to show respect and dignity. And then there's also an awareness, affirming the other person's, not just the public image, but their actual identity. They are not required to give up their identity in a conversation with you, even if it's a difficult conversation. So they can be themselves, and they are welcome to be themselves. You are not going to try and change them, and they don't have to leave their identity at the door. So that was affirm. So now we come to the C, context. In terms of context, I think we're all aware of the greater cultural context, and that is always important. I think in South Africa, definitely. I think in the rest of the world too. And in terms of context, the cultural context, we need to be aware of our own culture and be aware of the other person's culture. So understanding our own culture, it seems obvious, but we all know our own culture, but there's a part there's the water that we swim in, and we don't actually see so many things that we just take for granted. That, even, I think especially in the church, there are some things that we do in our church culture which we don't even see anymore. But if we imagine coming into the church from the outside, there are some really weird things going on. So, standing and singing together is actually weird. It's not something people commonly do. Closing your eyes in a public space is also, it's not something that people would commonly do. But there are many, many other things, and we need to learn to see the water that we are swimming in, and not assume that ours is the normal one. There's another nice acronym that Ian refers to. It says we need to check our weirdness. Now, weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. And many of us fall into that category, but actually we are only 15% of the world population. So we are weird. We are not the norm. And we need to be aware of that's a different perspective to come from, a different lens that we use. I mentioned earlier, be aware of who you may represent. So it might not just be about who you are and your cultural background, but actually who you represent. You might not identify with your cultural background, but you can't change the fact that, you look like them. So you represent them even if you don't actually feel like you fit. And then on the other hand, the understanding of the other person's culture, which might be more holistic than where you're coming from. It might be more relational. Your focus might be on getting the job done. It might be more about, like honor might be a bigger issue in that culture than what it is in yours. And maybe there isn't such a focus on being right and wrong from their culture. So there are a lot of things to consider. But at the same time, be aware of stereotypes. So don't assume that the other person fits in to whatever culture you think that they represent. And of course, the way to find out is to have a conversation, to ask them questions, and if you feel like you're actually missing something, like the conversation has gone somewhere completely different, then it might actually be that there's a cultural difference. And the only way to find out is to go, okay, so my emphasis right now is on who's right and who's wrong, but I'm getting the sense that your emphasis is different. Just tell me more, what's going on? And really the basis of all this is to suspend judgment. So don't just jump to conclusions, but actually be curious. Is there something else going on? And then on the other hand, that's the broader cultural context. I think we also need to give the conversation an immediate context. And what I'd say here is to give it a framework where you share expectations that you have around the conversation. Jeff van Vonderen stresses the importance of expectations, of making them clear, of making them overt. And we don't really do that. We just assume that people know that this is what we expect of them. And especially in a conflict situation, it can be helpful to actually have some guidelines or some expectations. I mentioned before the fact that we see ourselves as separate from the problem. So we are actually a team. We're going to co-create a solution to this problem. So we can have a more conversational mindset instead of a battle mindset where we're going at each other. We're an exploration team. We can encourage listening and reflecting. So again, if we reflect to somebody when they are saying, after they've said something, if we reflect what we've heard, then we're also inviting them to do the same when we talk, to actually reflect to us so we can check that they've also understood. Don't be rude or shame or get personal, like the tone that you use. Let's agree to having a tone that isn't attacking. And let's be curious about each other's point of view. Let's not just assume and jump to conclusions, but actually find out more about each other. You could also say, give it a time limit, which is also part of the expectations, which, I mean, it sounds funny, but we do that. We say, look, I've got an appointment at 8 o'clock. You know, that's how much time we have to have this conversation. If we don't finish it, we can set another time later and we can carry on. And then also you can agree to give each other a break when needed and say, look, you know, we're just going to have a quick toilet break or a tea break or whatever it is that you need. And another thing that we don't always agree upon, we don't talk about, is the fact that expressing emotions is okay. It's going to be okay for us to talk about how we're feeling. And we often try and suppress that, but it actually comes out. And if we try and keep it down, it comes out even louder. So if we can agree from the beginning that we're going to be okay with expressing emotions, it's a good guideline for the context of our immediate conversation. That was the C. So we've done almost crack. We're at the E. Emotions. So as I said, expression is okay. And actually, emotions can be a place of deep connection from across the divide. So we have empathy often with other people's emotions, as long as it's not anger. We have a tendency not to have empathy with other people's anger. It puts us on the defense, and we want to jump up and defend and be angry back. But we've experienced this in a lot of the dialogues that we've been in, is when we're talking about the content of the conversation and we're talking about the facts, then people disagree, and there's a lot of disagreement going on. But when we talk about the feelings that are going on underneath that, then we often find that even though people disagree, they actually realize, oh, this person is experiencing pain, this person is experiencing fear. I know those emotions. Actually, I'm feeling them right now. And despite the fact that we are on different ends of the spectrum of this conversation, of the facts, we actually do connect with each other on an emotional level. In terms of anger in the Bible, Jeff von Vonderud says there are 3 words that are used to describe it. So I don't speak Greek, but I'm going to try. The one is perigismos, which is the word for anger that is used in Ephesians 6, verse 4, where fathers are told not to provoke your children to anger. And apparently this anger is a suppressed anger. So it's about children concealing the anger and sort of driving it down. And this concealing anger in Ephesians we're told it's not a good idea. It actually is, it could land up being a sin to conceal their anger, or to make somebody else conceal their anger. And in general life, we also find that suppressed or repressed anger blocks ideas, and it actually doesn't open up possibilities. So we see, those things coming together to affirm the truth of that. In Galatians 5, verse 20, anger in the word tumas is listed as one of the acts of the flesh. And this means outbursts of anger. So just having angry outbursts is seen as sinful. And then there's a third word, I think it's orge, and that's the word that's used in Ephesians 4:26, and that's be angry and yet do not sin, which means that anger is not automatically a sin. It is possible to be angry and not to sin. And in this sense, anger is a signal that there's something important that's been going on, that something that is important to us has been threatened or damaged, and that we're actually, that emotion is a reaction against that deep feeling. And it could actually, underlying that anger could be some pain or some fear. It could be about losing something. And the idea here, what we are told to do, is do not let the sun go down on your anger. So anger itself is not the sin, but what you do with it can land up being sinful. If you have an angry outburst and you just leave casualties in your wake, that would be sinful. If you suppress it, then that could also be sinful. It actually means you're the one who's actually being the casualty of them in that sense. So we are told to talk to the other person. Sometimes it might be useful to give them time or warning, not just to jump on them right then and there, but to say, look, we really need to talk about this. Can we make a time that's useful for both of us? Don't talk to others about it. Obviously, gossiping to others about it is also going to land up being sinful and not actually helping the relationship. But not doing anything is also not the way that the Bible tells us to go. So yeah, so in terms of emotions, we don't need to be scared of anger, but we can try and understand what's going on underneath, and then try and express it in a way that isn't damaging to ourselves or to other people. So other people's emotions tend to be catching to us as well. So other people's anger tends to invite us to also be angry. We have a choice though. We don't need to react in anger. We can respond, and we can zoom out to have a bird's eye view, like look at our behavior. What are we doing with our anger? And some of the questions that are useful are, how am I behaving? Or what am I doing with my anger? And then why is this important to me? So if you have the presence of mind in that moment to just zoom out into a bird's eye view and go, what's actually going on here? What's the other level? Then that's a useful thing to do in a conflict. Let me move on to the F, freedom. So based in my identity in Christ, I don't need to prove that I am lovable, perfect, that I've got it all sorted out. I have the freedom to also do things in a different way. I have the freedom to forgive. I also have the freedom to repent. Now, I'm not saying that either of these are easy. And I think there's a lot of things to say about it, but I'm really just skimming over the surface. But Matthew 5:23 tells us, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, then leave and be reconciled. So what interests me about that is the fact that we are the ones who actually did the wrong thing there, and we are told that we shouldn't be focusing on our relationship with God if we know that there's something that we need to put right with somebody else, and we need to go and repent. So how can we cultivate an environment where it is possible for both of us to actually apologize, to repent, to forgive? And I think, it's a big topic. Again, we can only change ourselves and invite others to actually respond in kind. But one of the things would be to apologize quickly. So to not, if we've been convicted of doing something wrong, that we right away apologize, and obviously do it authentically. And I think part of the problem when we apologize is the way that we apologize. If we just say something like, I'm sorry if I hurt you, the if word doesn't work. It already means that you haven't actually recognized what you did wrong, and the apology is just not going to land. So apologizing in a way that's authentic and real and is going to land better is if you recognize what it is that you did. And you say, I'm sorry that I hurt you when I called you a toad. So, sorry. Stop. Yeah, would be
It's the worst to be
And this does take humility, because it means that we need to recognize that we can make mistakes. But if we bring that into the situation where we realize we're also capable of making mistakes and saying things wrong and sin in some way, then that humility just, invites people to be humble and not defensive in return. And an apology also needs to cost something, actually, to land and to be real. So what I mean by this is, yes, of course, it can cost something financial if there's reparation that needs to be made, but it can also be costing an actional commitment, so that there's real change. It's not just I'm sorry, but I'm going to carry on unchanged. It's I'm sorry, I recognize I did this wrong. I'm not going to do it again, and I'm going to make an effort to make this relationship work. It could also be, Ian Leslie says, it could be a status cost. Even something like calling yourself an idiot is actually a status cost. If you are somebody who really wants to come across as intelligent and you've done something which is really stupid, then calling it what it is can actually just make it more real to other people and have a bit of a cost involved. And so there's many more things to be said about that, but I'm going to move on. Unlocking the gridlock. So this is about trying not to fall into those previous patterns of predictable interaction. And often in conflict situations, this is not the first conflict we've had. It's not the first difficult conversation we've had with somebody. And we have a specific pattern that we follow. You start saying something, I say something back, it gets louder and louder, our emotions are really out there, we shout, and there's a predictable pattern often to those conversations that are difficult with the people that we have conflicts with regularly. So unlocking the gridlock that we get ourselves into means actually doing something that's different, that might be surprising. And I think it starts with us putting ourselves into their position. So even if we believe that their view is wrong, that they believe in false facts, and that we just totally disagree with what they are saying, then if we try to put ourselves into their position and try and explore what does it feel like to be on to be on their side, what could that feel like? If I really believed that in a lot of conspiracy theories out there, what would it feel like? I would actually be incredibly fearful. And just starting with that can lead me into reacting or responding in a different way, responding rather than reacting. A challenge could also be to find the kernel of truth in what it is that they are bringing. So in everybody's story, there is a kernel of truth. It might not be easy to find for some of us, but there actually is some truth there. And if we try and find that, then we can also unlock that gridlock. We can also be curious about what's going on, or wonder. I wonder what's actually going on underneath that. And one of the challenges is also that we have a tendency to try and build a straw man, to argue against an idea that we have filtered down and watered down to an easy argument. And one of the challenges is to actually build a steel man, to try and understand the other person's point of view so that we have a strong understanding of where they are, and we have to make a better argument in terms of approaching what they are saying. Then we need to question the assumption that our interpretation is 100% right and resist the urge to correct them straight away. So if our aim is to continue the conversation rather than just ending the conversation, ending the conflict by proving that we are right, then we have a very different conversation. We don't go into that gridlock. So a question we can ask ourselves is, how can I make this disagreement fruitful in some way? Then there are also some ideas that subvert that tug-of-war dynamic. Avoid oversimplifications, because we do that. When we disagree with other people, we just oversimplify and actually explore nuance and explore flexibility. Try and, in terms of emotions, we often, in a conflict situation, our emotions become limited, and we have just a few emotions that we express and a few emotions that we accept from the other person. So increase the range, express empathy. Sometimes amusement will help. sometimes cracking a joke about yourself actually breaks the gridlock. And yeah, just sometimes sharing an insight that you've had as well can also just broaden things. And learn about the other person. So try and ask good questions about them. Why is not always the good question. You know, if you think back to your childhood, then why was sometimes used in a very demeaning way. Like, you know, why on earth did you do this? So why has a tendency to put us on the defense. But questions that start with how, like, how does this fit into the rest of your life? Or what benefits are there in this? What draws you to this point of view? What convinces you? Those kinds of questions can be more opening to the conversation. Or a phrase like, help me understand, or tell me more. And then there's an interesting idea that Nancy Klein uses in Time to Think, which she calls timed talk, which I've yet to actually explore. But what she says is give each other the same amount of time to talk. So set a timer for, let's say, 3 minutes. And one person talks 3 minutes. As soon as the timer goes, they have to stop mid-sentence, mid-word. And then the other person has an opportunity to respond to what they've said. And she says there will be a time when it's heated, and that's okay. You can expect it because this conversation is about something you care about. But as you have an opportunity to first of all talk without interruption, you actually feel more heard. And as you have an opportunity to respond to that 3 minutes before, you know, there's like 10 minutes of tirade that's gone over you, you actually also have the opportunity to try and give your point of view before it doesn't even fit anymore because you haven't had an opportunity. So it's also a nice way to equal the power differential between you. Because usually one person is more vocal or more adept at words and more interruptive, if that's an adjective, and the person who takes over the conversation and the other person ends up not having that opportunity. So if you have 3 minutes, or 2 minutes, whatever works. But yeah, that would be part of the agreements in terms of how you're going to have this conversation. And it might feel a bit stilted, but maybe it works for you. And then the last one, listen, which, as I said, is actually the beginning of it all, the most important thing. There's Marlene Chisholm said, I think it was her, the one who listens first controls the direction of the conversation. So we might not think that. We're very eager to be the one who says the first thing and has the last word as well. But actually the one who listens first and really listens is the one who has a better chance of controlling the conversation in terms of, I don't want to say control, in a box, but actually the direction, so that it's not going to be a vicious, attacking conversation, but it's going to be a fruitful conflict. So no interruptions, I think, is really obvious, but it's also very hard for us to do that. When somebody says something and we go, no, but that's wrong, or that triggers us, we have a tendency to want to interrupt them, to just right away. But no interruptions is one of the very important things if you're going to have a fruitful conversation. Listen for understanding, not for reaction. So again, somebody says something and we go, oh, and then we start wording our reaction in our minds already without actually understanding it. If we listened a little bit more, we'd understand that they were in a completely different place to where that sentence went. So summarizing what we have heard is a very useful way of checking that we've actually really understood. It makes you a bit vulnerable because when you say something and you say, okay, so I've heard this and this, and will go, no, sorry, you've misheard me completely. So you make yourself vulnerable if you think that you're a good listener and suddenly you realize, oh, maybe I'm not. But it is conducive to making the conversation with a good outcome. And also, if you can summarize what you've heard in terms of content, but also summarize the emotion that you've heard underneath, then that actually gives you an opportunity to connect. There are 3 levels of listening. You can listen with all your senses. So you can listen to the words, the content, you can hear the tone, You can see, so seeing is part of listening because you can see their body language and how they're expressing themselves. So that's the first level. And even though it involves a lot, it's only one level. And then the second level is the emotions going on underneath. So if you've used all your senses and trying to listen, then you can pick up on the emotions that are going on. And then the third level is what needs or desires people are expressing. Because especially in your conflict situations, in your difficult conversations, there are a lot of needs and desires going on underneath. We are in conflict because we are trying to meet some sort of need. And if you can find out what need that is, then it also determines how you can respond. And in differential says there are sort of three basic needs that we all are trying to meet. The one is unconditional love. The second is that we are valuable, important, or capable. So it's more about our worth, our skills. And then the third is that we are not alone, that we actually belong to a community. So if you can hear, if you can listen to which need is being expressed, then if you don't listen to that, you can actually make it worse. Because if somebody is saying something that comes from a need to belong, and you just react with a lot of loud, angry outbursts, then you are driving them away rather than helping them to belong. And so if we can listen to which need is expressed, then we can actually try and meet that need, or to point them to God and bring them closer to God in terms of the need that He can meet. Because ultimately, these needs on a very deep level can only really be met by God in relationship with Him. I think, so that's graceful. And then I think the one thing I just want to mention is that there are sometimes really difficult people where your best intent and your best trying to come into this conflict situation and into this conversation in an embracing way is not going to be met with joy and reciprocity. And sometimes people are not going to be willing to talk. And we need to actually be okay with that. So there might be people you might want to talk about a specific conflict, and the other person will say, no, there's nothing going on, it's fine. And even though it's not, there is something going on. The fact that they've made that decision is something we need to respect. It's their choice, so we need to accept them. That's their choice, and they don't want to work on the relationship, and we can't work on a relationship on our own. That is just a fact. It needs to. So if we are going to continue with a relationship, if we make a decision that we're going to continue, we just have to accept that that's the level it's going to be on. Even if we want to take it to a deeper place, if it's not met by a response that's positive, then that's just the way it is. Then in terms of another one of our choices is to continue the relationship, but make our own boundaries clear. So that again is about my choice. And with difficult people, I might say, okay, this is the line up to this point. I will agree to, if I feel that somebody is taking advantage of me, I need to set the line. At this point, sorry, I will, a conflict situation could arise out of somebody always expecting you to respond to their WhatsApps at midnight or whatever. And then you need to make clear, like, I want to carry on the relationship with you, but my boundary is 9:30, whatever it is. So that's another way that we can carry on a relationship with a difficult person. And then, of course, we also have the choice to actually end the relationship from our own point of view, to realize that this difficult relationship is not going to lead us, either of us, anywhere closer to God, and somebody else is going to be in a relationship with this person in the future, and it's not, I don't need to control that person's life. I'm not responsible for them. It's in God's hands, and we pray and we leave it with God and say, okay, at this point, I'm going to be okay with the end of the relationship. That's what I have to say. Oops, and it was long. Sorry. So if we have 10 minutes for questions.